Hi, Jackson. This is Ira, and I am recording here some audio feedback on your statement of belief, which I hope will be useful as you complete final revisions on your major essay for the course, Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts. So, essentially what I'm going to do is walk through your statement of belief, and I'm offering feedback on this or thoughts on this, not so much because you should have done something different with this. This is a perfectly good version of what it is. But rather because I want you to think through, or I want to push you on a few different pieces of how it all fits together as you're working on the major essay for the course, which, as you know, is a much more rigorously theoretical piece of writing. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through, I'm going to note some of the things that I think are quite nice, and I'm also going to note some places where I have questions or want to push you a little bit. So, you start off by sort of presenting argument as communication and talking in broad terms about what communication is for or about, or its unavoidability, etc. And that brings you to quarter and the idea that argument is not, so first, is not a hard and fast event that occurs in structured settings, but rather pervades all aspects of our lives. Obviously, I'm amenable to that view. But I'd be interested to hear you trace it out a little bit more fully with regard to how that functions in digital contexts, obviously, in the major essay. So what does that mean exactly, in other words? So you note that Quarter asserts the notion that when argument occurs, individuals reach a certain level of vulnerability that allows one to share a piece of their identity in their argument. And so you're following Quarter here, so far in the essay, in treating argument as a kind of a clash of identities, or a contestation of identities, or a merging of identities in some way that's troubled and most importantly vulnerable, a vulnerable sharing. And so again, in the Defining Good Argument Digital Context essay, one of the things I'll be interested to see here is how you work through that idea of vulnerability in digital spaces, especially anonymous digital spaces, or digital spaces where multiple parties are arguing all together, and the communication at stake is often not even necessarily intended for the interlocutor, but rather two people are arguing with each other in precisely the way that Quarter sees as not so good, which is performance. That is to say, arguing with somebody not for the purpose of sharing vulnerably together with that person you're arguing with, but rather for a kind of display for a third party. And Quarter sees that as really problematic, and that, of course, is one of the primary argument dynamics in digital contexts. So I'm interested to hear how you see that, and how thinking about that in digital context shapes your very Quarderian sense. I mean, again, obviously, I'm sympathetic to Quarter. I assigned him. I think he has a really nice, lovely perspective. But also, clearly there's something happening with argument in digital contexts that isn't quite Quarderian, and that maybe is good, or can be good. And so I want to kind of, I want to think about whether, I want you to think about whether argument can be good even when people are not really in a space of vulnerable sharing, but rather are performing something for other parties, for other readers. You say Quarter rationalizes. I'm not really sure what you mean by rationalizes here. Often when we say rationalizes, we mean it a little negatively. Usually like it refers to giving plausible but perhaps untrue reasons ex post facto for actions that we've taken or attitudes that we've held. So, anyways, I think though that you mean it more positively here. So Quarter offers reasons for a very key concept, specifically approaching an argument with interest. And this seems like it might be a nice way of thinking about how argument in digital spaces and digital contexts can be good. It has to do with interest. And I think what I'd be interested to know is, what does that mean to you? So what does it mean from your perspective to approach an argument with interest? Especially if the person you're arguing with isn't necessarily someone you're trying to persuade or convince. Here I was not totally sure what you mean. So you said a very simplistic and seemingly churlish. I think that's I would suggest a different word here. Idea of sharing, acknowledging our biases and privileges, and incorporating their influence into our understanding of another's argument, that's lovely. But you say, arguably, this is already done, but to a very definite and noticeable extent. And I'm not really sure what you mean there. I think a lot of times that doesn't really, we don't acknowledge our biases and privileges. We don't incorporate their influence into how we think about one another's arguments. We fail pretty frequently in these ways, most of us. So I'm not really sure what you mean here. If you're saying we should do that more, or you're saying it's already happening a lot, I'm a little confused there. And indeed, like your next line suggests that, we only subscribe to what we want to hear. In other words, it's sort of the opposite of us already acknowledging our biases and so on and so forth. And so, again, that's fine for the statement of belief. This is a good version of what it is. But as you're working on the Defining Good Arguments in Digital Context essay, I want you to make sure that you're not letting your own sort of thinking run away with you. In other words, or your own writing run away with you. I really want to push you to make sure that everything you're saying fits together systematically, like a jigsaw puzzle. All the pieces are aligned and have their place in the overall structure of the argument. And here, I'm pointing out that this is a spot where, in fact, these two things seem quite at odds. That we're already acknowledging our biases, and we only subscribe to what we want to hear. Those seem like opposite statements. And so I'm left here unsure. Well, which of these do you think is the case? Or are they both the case? How do they fit together? How do we do this one while also doing this one? What does that look like, etc.? Here, it seems like you're saying that regardless of how other people formulate their arguments, we have a responsibility to extrapolate wisdom from even the most strenuous or difficult experiences. So if I'm following what you're saying there, I think that's really interesting, and I'd like to hear more about that. So, like, do we have a responsibility to engage with trolls, for instance? I think is a really interesting question for this assertion, when we're thinking about argument in digital contexts. Or do we have a responsibility to not engage with trolls? In other words, what's our responsibility to one another when we know that at least some people in digital contexts are producing arguments that they themselves don't believe, that they're not being vulnerable, yada, yada, yada. Here, it seems like you're trying to come to a next idea and you're not quite there. So with argument comes the temporality of ethics and moral divisions, the continuous formulation, shaping and reshaping of ideals. As I take you, you're saying that one of the things that happens in argument is that we're constantly reformulating our sense of the good. And I think that's great. I think it's a lovely idea. I just want to see you unpack that a little bit more. Because that idea that we're constantly reshaping our idea of the good is not exactly the same as the next thing that you're saying, which is that we're constantly shaping our arguments to better persuade or address our specific audiences, which is, I think, also true. I mean, I think these things are both true, but they're not really here systematically linked. So that's something I'd hope to see more of, that systematic working out of how the pieces fit together exactly in your rigorous theoretical essay. And I think that this is a really important point, that what we count as good argument is actually based in a lot of different ways on the different institutions, individuals, and so on and so forth that have shaped our understanding of argument. So that our understanding of good argument itself is always kind of changing over time. And one of the things I'd be interested to ask you is, so do you think there are any, for you personally, are there static principles at stake there? Are there some versions of argument that have held up as good for you over time or not? And if so, how and what are they? And if not, why all this stuff above about being, open to change and so on and so forth? Because that does seem like a static principle. So I think you're making a really interesting point here, and I want to kind of see you tie it in a little bit better with your earlier concern for ethics of a sort. Here, when you talk about the effectiveness of an argument essentially determines how I perceive it, it actually seems like you're saying something totally at odds with the things that you're saying earlier. Because earlier throughout this statement, and again, not a problem for the statement of a belief, but it is something to think through for the theoretical defining good argument in digital context essay. Because essentially this line here lays the burden of responsibility on the arguer. The person who makes the argument determines the audience's perspective. But previously, you were suggesting that the way that we listen or receive arguments is also important. And so those, and in fact, you're going even further. You're saying that even when an argument's sort of problematically formulated, we have some responsibility to draw something of value out of it. And that seems totally at odds with the idea that the effectiveness of an argument essentially determines how I perceive it. So I want to ask you to think those two things against each other a little more. Doesn't mean you can't hold two conflicting views. Of course you can. But the goal of a theoretical piece is to think about how our conflicting views fit together. What is the mediating set of ideas that makes two conflicting views work together in some way? Yeah, so with all that in mind, I'm really interested in hearing how you work all this into digital context specifically, and I enjoyed reading this piece. I'm looking forward to reading the fuller theoretical articulation soon. Thanks.